Hello, or as the kids these days are saying, up yours, woke moralists. Welcome back to J Hutch Talks Too Much. My name is J Hutch. And remember, if you are enjoying what it is that I'm doing, if you happen to be enjoying what it is that I'm doing, and as one of our commenters has already said, they are looking forward to this. And I do believe that is based on past experience. That is Ryan. Thank you, Ryan, former and future guest on J Hutch Talks Too Much, so long as this keeps on going. If you do like what it is that we're doing, please feel free to like the video. If you haven't yet subscribed to J Hutch Talks Too Much, please feel free to subscribe to J Hutch Talks Too Much. If you are listening to the audio version of this podcast on, I guess it's Apple, I have not yet put it up on any other streaming services as far as I know. Please feel free to rate and review the podcast on there. Thanks so much. It's great to have you with us. Yes, tonight we are doing the at least final for a while podcast on Franz Kafka. I started this discussion on Kafka all the way back in January. I'm just trying to see if I wrote down the date. I don't, but it was sometime in mid-January that I started, and we've talked about several Kafka texts since then. We started with a discussion on the judgment and metamorphosis. I talked with Ryan, in fact, about the trial. I have talked about In the Penal Colony, and tonight we are talking about The Castle. So before I do, I just want to also say, first of all, thank you for those of you who have been watching the Kafka videos or listening to the podcasts. I hope that you have enjoyed them. I guess what I'm probably going to do is maybe focus on another writer after this, and it could be a number of different authors. Preferably an author that was once quite popular, but now is not necessarily as widely read. Someone that we can go into in some substantial detail over a series of episodes. The one that I'm leaning towards right now, going with, is Edgar Allan Poe, partly because I did not intend to take as long as I did going through these Kafka stories. I didn't intend for it to be a 7-month process, but it was. And that's partly just because a lot of life things happened. And I'm sure they will continue on happening. And I will be teaching a lot coming up quite soon. So Poe might be a good one to do in the meantime, not only because he's a great author, but also because his works have a tendency of being quite short. And so there's a kind of a virtue in that for me over an author who I would also love to do someday, like Tolstoy, or other authors like Dostoevsky or Charles Dickens, who write mammoth books. Again, I do want to do podcasts on those eventually, but I don't know if it is necessarily the right time to do a sort of deep dive on those books. But if anybody out there is watching these videos and has any suggestions about who another author could be that we could look at, I've heard other good suggestions as well, like John Steinbeck. People like that, I'd be very happy to look into, think about. So keep that in mind. But for now, let's go on to The Castle. And actually, I'm glad that Ryan is here, because I was actually, I'm going to address one of my viewers right now who's here and just say that I know that you're probably not set up to talk about this, but I did specifically save the link for the studio. If you, in particular, wanted to come on after I give my spiel, which could be about an hour, and go over some of the things that I talked about. I know that you're not set up the same way, and I know that you haven't read the book in a while, but if you're interested in doing that, let me know, and I can send you the link. But with all that in mind, there was one but in there. But with that in mind, you can let me know in the comments whenever you'd like. I'm going to start in at least on the okay, but maybe. Well, let me know as I continue to go through it, and at any point you can tell me. I will be somewhat going back and forth between my notes and the screen, so it might take a while for me to see it. I hope the folks at home have enjoyed this one-on-one exchange that I'm having with my audience member. But now I'm going to move on first, at least, to give a synopsis as best as I can on Kafka's The Castle. So we begin with a man. He's supposedly a land surveyor. The man's name is K, much like the central character from the trial. K is, however, a different character from the character that was in the trial, and he enters into this village that he's never been to before. He goes to an inn to get some sleep, and he's told that he needs a permit from the castle, Castle West, the castle is called, in order to spend the night in town. Kay says he's been invited by the Count West, to work in the village as a land surveyor. Kay finds that most people seem to have great faith in the castle and the way that it organizes the way that things happen in the village, much in the same way that people have faith in the legal system in the trial, even though in that book, nobody seems to know exactly what's going on. Nevertheless, those who know about this legal system that Kay is ensnared in the trial seem to have faith in that system. The next day, back to the castle, Kay makes unsuccessful attempts to get to the castle. He runs into a schoolmaster who tells Kay that there's no difference between the peasants in the village and the castle up on the hill. He goes to a tanner's house, man named Lasman, but he is soon thrown out. He meets his two assistants, Jeremiah and Arthur. Jeremiah and Arthur look exactly alike. They are also, as the book goes on, they seem to be idiots who only really serve kind of as comic relief to constantly infuriate Kay. Kay then returns to the inn, having been unsuccessful in his efforts to get to the castle. Then a messenger named Barnabas brings Kay a letter saying that his immediate superior is the mayor, and the mayor will give him details of his job. The letter, however, was written by a man by the name of Mr. Clam. Mr. Clam is a castle director who also says in the letter that he will be, quote, keeping an eye on Kay. Kay takes a liking to Barnabas, the person who delivers him the letter, and it kind of thinks that Barnabas is going to be maybe an in to get him into the castle. And as Barnabas leaves, Kay decides to follow with him, thinking that Barnabas is going to walk him to the castle. But in fact, Barnabas simply walks Kay to Barnabas's home, where Kay meets Barnabas's family. Barnabas's sister, Olga, then takes Kay to an inn where he meets Freda, a barmaid who turns out to be Clam. Remember the guy who wrote the letter? Turns out to be Clam's mistress. And at this point, it's looking like Clam is really Kay's only serious connection to the castle. Kay and Freda, however, become intimate that night at the bar, and she decides that she's going to leave Clam for Kay. This upsets, in particular, the inn's landlady, who herself used to be Clam's mistress and still has enormous respect for Clam. She tells Kay that Clam doesn't even speak to people from the village, never has done, and in fact, it was Freda's greatest honor that he used to at least call her name, an honor that the landlady feels that Kay took away from her. But now Kay is intent on marrying Freda. He then has a meeting with the mayor, who says that it was a mistake that Kay was invited to come to the village at all, that in fact there is no need for a land surveyor, but they'll look into it. Kay then gets offered a position as the janitor at the school where he would live, and Freda persuades him to take the job. So he and Freda and these two oafish assistants decide to move into the school, take up residence there. Now, during the first night at the school, it gets so cold that Kay breaks into the shed to get wood. And it's at one point, Kay wakes up with one of the assistants lying beside him, and Kay punches him. The next day they wake up, the teacher and the class have walked into the room where Kay and Freda and the assistants are sleeping currently, and tell them that they need to get out while the class is going on. Kay almost immediately gets fired when they find out that he broke into the shed. Now, he refuses to leave, but he does fire his two assistants and throws them out of the classroom, locking them out. Kay then goes to Barnabas's house again, seeing Barnabas to be a connection to the castle. But he learns that even though Barnabas works at the castle, he's really not privy to its inner workings. There's then a very long section of the book where Olga, Barnabas's sister, talks about her family's downfall, how they were once an important family in the village, but they lost everything after her sister, Amalia, refused the advances of a castle official, a man named Sortini. She refused his advances in a very sort of public way. He sends her this letter, which, according to Olga, was written, I'm quoting, was written in the most vulgar language, using expressions I'd never come across before. And Amalia tears it up and she hits the messenger who brought it. And then the whole village at that point turns their back on them, and they essentially become outcasts and they fall into poverty. Kay is somewhat touched by this story, but then he leaves the home where one of his old assistants is waiting to tell him that Freda has left him, because Freda believes that Kay was having an affair either with Olga or Amalia, whom she despises like everybody else in the village. As you recall, that family has been shunned. Then Kay finds out that he's been called to the inn to meet with this guy named Erlanger, who is Clam's secretary. Now, he ends up being kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And while waiting, he gets really tired. He enters this room where he meets this guy named Burgle. Burgle, we don't get much clarity on, but we get some idea that Burgle can actually help Kay in all of the troubles he has been experiencing so far. But as he is telling Kay this, Kay falls asleep and doesn't really hear what Burgle has to say. And that's really essentially all that happens. He does end up getting the meeting with Clam's assistant, Erlanger. Erlanger simply tells Kay that Kay has to make sure that Freda goes back to being a barmaid. And then the book ends naturally in mid-sentence, because like every book that Kafka wrote, and I believe he only wrote 3, The Trial, America, and The Castle, and none of them are finished. But they're all unfinished in different ways. The Trial is unfinished, but it does have a final chapter, because when Kafka started writing it, he knew he had this propensity for not being able to finish things. So he wrote the first chapter, and then he wrote the last chapter, and then he started writing all the parts in between, which he didn't finish. So we do have that last chapter, but we do have probably quite a bit of empty space in between the penultimate chapter and the final chapter. With this book, however, it ends literally mid-sentence. This is the final sentence of the book. She held a trembling hand out to Kay and made him sit down beside her, and she spoke with an effort. It was an effort to understand her, but what she said. And that's the end of The Castle. Now, some of you who haven't read The Castle before might think, well, if that's the way that it ends, should I be reading this book? Why put in all the effort to get through, what page is this? Page 280 pages of this book and have it end off just like that? No ending. Well, obviously, it's up to you whether or not you want to read The Castle or not. But a couple things that I will say. For one, I think that the book is a great book. It's extremely well written. It has a lot of thought-provoking things, many of which, or some of which, I hope I will be talking about in just a couple of minutes. So if you are looking for something that will, stir your thoughts about various things, then The Castle is a great book for you to read, even though it's unfinished. The other thing, and this is a point that I have been raising a lot when it comes to Kafka, is that Kafka seems to really, to me, at the very least, seems to tap in to, I think, one's subconscious, or at least he does mine. He evokes, in many ways, a dream-like world. Reading one of his books is kind of like reading one of your dreams to some degree. And again, on the surface level, that might not sound particularly interesting, but he does it so effectively. It's one thing to say, yeah, he writes something that's like a dream. It's another thing to kind of read it and actually experience that. And there is something about Kafka that, to me, while you're reading him, at least for me, again, you also then later dream his text, because he so effectively seems to speak to that part of your brain. And the trial does that. Metamorphosis does that. And I think that the castle quite effectively does that too. And the fact is, and many of us know this, that most of our dreams never have a satisfying literary conclusion. They don't end in a way that we often expect a novel to end, or a movie to end, or a TV show to end, or something like that. They either trail off, or they fade into something else, or we get woken up and it abruptly comes to an end. And of course, we always say in those moments, "Oh, I wish I could have kept on dreaming." But again, part of it is that experience, right? That's part of the experience of dreaming. I would imagine most of our dreams never have an ending in the way that we think, and so it makes sense to me, even though it wasn't Kafka's intention, I don't think, to not end his books. But it makes sense in many ways that so many of them, that none of the novels do end, because in many ways it just goes along very nicely with that dreamlike world that he is creating. So again, when you're reading Kafka, it's not necessarily about reading a story that makes sense in a typical conventional way. It is about entering into an alternate world, a different sort of reality. And it doesn't really matter in some sense if it ends or not, to a large degree. So yeah, I mean, that's my feeling about it. And if you, again, if you don't want to read it just because it doesn't end, that's certainly up to you. But I do think it's worthwhile taking a look at. Now, I want to really begin my discussion on the castle by talking about a few different kinds of approaches to the book. First, we can see it as a kind of complementary text to the trial. You can see them both being discussed together. So, for example, a few months ago when I had Ryan on to talk about the trial, one of the things that Ryan said, I think either in the video or afterwards when we were chatting, he said, maybe you should wait a little bit before talking about the castle because there are so many sort of similarities. They're both doing something quite similar. And after reading The Castle, I hadn't read The Castle yet at that point. I don't disagree with that. There is a lot in common. If you watched the conversation that Ryan and I had on the trial, you might recall that one of the things that I saw that was at work in the book was that I thought that Kafka was responding, maybe consciously, maybe not, to a particular condition of modernity or to the sort of early 20th century, namely that there was no longer the possibility of finding a system that could provide one with solid answers to one's question. The big one, of course, being sort of this decentralizing of religious truths. Now, there had, of course, been periods of uncertainty in the past. If you go to sort of Renaissance era literature or the early modern period, the period that Shakespeare is writing in, or John Donne, or eventually John Milton, you have all sorts of things that were creating chaos to some degree. There's the discovery of the so-called New World. It, of course, wasn't actually new, but it was referred to as the New World. The collapse of the belief that the universe revolved around the Earth. There's the inventing of the printing press, which suddenly increased literacy and made people confront all sorts of ideas that they never necessarily were able to confront before. Well, this was an era then that challenged a lot of preconceived notions. But nevertheless, I would say despite the kind of chaos that permeated that era, Shakespeare's era, it wasn't quite the same way of knowing that was essentially replaced, where one way of knowing was replaced with another way of knowing. England's official religion, for example, switched from Catholic to Protestant. So it was like, yeah, it's not like we're left with this idea of, I don't know if we can believe in anything anymore, or I don't know if I have a grasp of the truth. No, it was kind of like one truth was sort of replaced with another truth. Yes, it probably made many people in that era think, yeah, the things that I have faith in and I have trusted, it's quite possible that it could turn out to be something different tomorrow. But I don't think anybody thought, if I go looking for something, I'm never going to be able to find it. Because you did, again, have one sort of set of knowledge being replaced by another, Catholic being replaced by Protestant, the idea that the universe revolves around the Earth, moving towards, the solar system revolving around the sun. It's just one kind of body of knowledge replacing another. Well, in the modern era in which Kafka is writing, though, it seems to be a lot less stable. Though some authors still, like people like T.S. Eliot, who writes The Wasteland, is still wanting to find some way of making sense of the chaotic world. And I would say that in many ways Kafka does too. He does say quite famously, there's a quote by Kafka in which he says, "There is infinite hope in the universe." So there is this kind of notion that there is maybe something graspable. However, Kafka builds on that and says, yeah, there is infinite hope in the universe, but not for us, right? And that's a very Kafka line, right? There's infinite hope, but not for us. We're not going to be able to have, we're pretty much hopeless. I think that's about as positive as it gets for Kafka. The fact that he's even, at least admitting that hope is out there. I'm just going to take a drink. So ultimately, then, I do think that Kafka was living in a world suddenly where there were no real substantive and reliable answers to our questions. He lived in a world now that was becoming more and more the world of the sciences. And in the world of the sciences, and I mentioned this in the trial discussion, all answers inevitably lead to more questions, right? And so the truth was always something that, again, seemed graspable within your reach, but in the act of reaching for it, you're left with more questions. You're left with the feeling that you know less rather than you know more, right? And all that seems to be, I think, part of our experience still. I think by now it's almost a cliche that the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. And I think that this is the experience of Kay in the trial. He's charged with a crime at the beginning of the book. He doesn't know what the crime is, and he doesn't know what the legal body is that has charged him with this crime. And while he talks to many people throughout the book who seem to have some insight into the legal system and into his case, he not only never knows what's going on, he seems to get more and more in the dark as the book goes on. In fact, it quite literally ends up with him in the dark when he gets to the cathedral. So I do think that one can do the same kind of reading of the castle. Kay is similarly trying to access the castle, to access a significant representative from the castle. He's trying to understand the inner workings of the castle, and he's even just trying to nail down what his role in this town is supposed to be, what his job is supposed to be. And not only does he never gain access to the castle, not only does he never get this information, he's just left with mounting information, kind of like growing paperwork on a desk. And as two scholars point out, Barnabas, his account of the castle, indicates that there really is nobody that seems to have this kind of lack of access to the castle. They say, is it really castle service Barnabas is doing? He goes into the offices, but are the offices part of the real castle? Because of the barriers put up by the physical castle, it is unclear what constitutes the real castle, the absolute authority. So even when we find out that there's a person like Barnabas who purportedly goes to the castle, even Barnabas doesn't seem to have access to the castle in any sort of material way. So again, yes, I do think we could do the same sort of reading of the castle that we did for the trial. And I think that it is also, along with that, worthwhile pointing out that what was for a very long time a popular reading of the castle was in many ways kind of the opposite of the interpretation that I've just given, which is that some have suggested that the castle, the search for the castle, is a metaphor for the search for religious salvation. Now, from what I understand, this theory was put forth most stridently by Kafka's friend Max Brod, who I talk about in the first video, the one on the judgment and metamorphosis. Max Brod basically was the one who published all of Kafka's unpublished work. So that was put forward by Brod, but it was also put forward by a guy by the name of Edwin Muir, M-U-I-R, who translated Kafka's works. And so both Broad and Muir were very important in bringing Kafka to the world. But to quote Richie Robertson, in 1930, Muir describes the occupants of the castle as heavenly powers, representatives of divine law that demands unconditional reverence and unconditional obedience from mankind. Muir later says that the castle is like the Pilgrim's Progress, a religious allegory. The desire of the hero in both cases is to work out his salvation. To do so, in both cases again, it is necessary that certain moves should be gone through and gone through without a single hitch. And this was really the first sort of, I would say, dominant interpretation of the castle, but it has also been challenged many times since then. And I'm not necessarily going to outright say it's wrong, but I am going to say that my overall reading of Kafka makes me see the book somewhat differently. So, what do I think is going on in this book? Well, I'll tell you right after this sip of tea. Well, for one, I don't see the castle as representing heavenly powers, nor do I see it as being full of representatives who represent divine law. In fact, the one major example that I will keep coming back to again and again is a castle representative, the one named Sortini, the one who propositions Amalia. He's not somebody that you would expect to associate with anything that could be called heavenly powers. But I do want to turn to this idea for a minute of something that I brought up in previous discussions on Kafka, which is a discussion of the way that one can participate in one's own powerlessness, or how easy it is to become servants to the powerful. I talked about this in my first video on Kafka when I talked about the story, The Judgment, where at the end of that story, the very weak father of the central character, Jorg Benderman, the father tells Jorg, I condemn you to death by drowning. And what does the character do? He runs out of the house and jumps off of a bridge into water, effectively doing exactly what his father says. And I talked about how, yes, this is kind of ridiculous. You wouldn't ever expect this to happen for the most part. But in some ways, this is an exaggeration of how power frequently operates, especially how it operates in a democracy rather than, let's say, a tyranny, where it is the people who overwhelmingly have the power, as Jorg Benderman does. He's much stronger than his father is in this episode, yet they are convinced by those who are in charge that they are weak, or that they are not clever enough, or that they're not knowledgeable enough to be the ones that make the day-to-day decisions about their lives. And so we have this belief that really it's the people in charge who have the right to be in charge, to have the power over my life and make the rules that I follow, because they have some special skill or ability that I don't have. I'm incapable of doing those things, of having that control. So I must turn it over to them. And so rather than people actually behaving from their own spontaneous desire, they simply unthinkingly follow the rule that their masters have set out for them, even though they are really, at least en masse, more powerful than the rulers and the masters that have set out those rules for them to follow. Now, near the beginning of the castle, when Kay goes out wandering around the village, he runs into the schoolmaster, who says that there's no difference between the peasants and the castle, meaning between the ordinary citizens who live in the village and the people who live up high on the hill in the castle. Now, this can mean several things. It could mean what he's describing is a purely democratic society. Everybody in this village, they're all equals. The people down here, the peasants, the people up there in the castle. Just because you're seeing that delineation doesn't mean it's real. We're all actually equal. And that might be true. What the schoolmaster could be describing could actually be a functional democracy. On the other hand, though, it can mean that there's no difference because the villagers have simply internalized the rules that those in the castle want them to follow. Therefore, everybody happens to believe the same thing. They all have the same values. They all believe that the same thing is right and the same thing is wrong. And that is a consequence of the castle having an effect that people accept things as they are. There's no difference. The castle believes one thing, and the villagers have been cultivated to agree with it. This is the view of one scholar who says, and here I'm quoting, in his interaction with the villagers, Kay must confront not only their hostility, but also their unquestioning obeisance to the castle rulers. No unauthorized persons can stay in the village without permit. No one can get a permit. No one can see Clam's face. No one who is not a gentleman can stay at the gentleman's inn. No one who's not an official, servant, or messenger can reach the castle. And it is true. Almost nobody does question these things. As Kay eventually notes to Olga, this is Kay talking, respect for the authorities is innate here. And then it's instilled in you throughout your lives in many different ways and from all sides. And you yourselves help this along as best as you can. Two other scholars make the same point when they say perhaps what imbues the castle with meaning and authority is the very people over whom it rules, the people who trust in the authority of the castle and therefore give it control. And indeed, the way that, for example, everyone around Kay treats Clam, the castle director, is an example of this. We're given no reason at all to see Clam as a great person. In fact, apart from at a distance once, we never even see Clam. We only hear about him. But everybody talks about Clam, like, for example, his former mistresses, the landlady and Freda, as if he were a god. Yet everything indicates that Clam has treated both these women as if they're disposable. When he's done with one, he moves on to the other. So some writers have pointed out that there's a relationship between the way that power functions in the castle and the way that Jeremy Bentham saw power operating in terms of what he called the Panopticon. Now, as you'll see, I'm kind of on board with this, but I'm kind of not. But it's nevertheless worth pointing out, and it's probably worth explaining a little bit in terms of what the Panopticon is. For one, I do want to say I do think that the Panopticon gets way too much attention in a lot of contemporary discussions about power, but it should be discussed at least once on the podcast, so I will talk about it now. So what is the Panopticon? Well, the Panopticon is a structure that was quite, famously constructed for a prison. And it was a way to try to modify and affect the behavior of the prisoners. So what you do is the Panopticon is a tower that's built up in the center, and the prisoners are all around the Panopticon. And the assumption is that there are guards up in the tower who can see every move every prisoner makes. Now, the prisoners cannot see up into the tower. So it's quite possible that there will be a guard in that tower. It's quite possible there won't be a guard in that tower. It's in fact quite theoretically possible that there is never a guard in that tower. However, the prisoners have to act as if there's always a guard in that tower. And Bentham would say that the beautiful thing about this Panopticon is that it eventually does change the behavior of the prisoners. So that at first, of course, they're always being very careful not to do something wrong because the prisoner might see them. But Bentham will argue, and I'm not saying this is correct, this is just where Bentham was coming from, that it becomes like muscle memory, so that eventually they're just trained to do it naturally. And Bentham believes, and you can find quotes from Bentham that suggest this, that this idea should be applied really to the entire world, so that it works as a way to sort of normalize all behavior. He came up with a Panopticon-like structure for a workplace, where you could send a lot of the people who in England had been previously receiving welfare, a lot of them most likely because they had significant mental health issues, they had addictions, but his suggestion would be send these people, rather than give them welfare, he would say, send them to this workhouse where they're constantly being watched. And eventually, just like the prisoners, their behavior will be modified, will be affected, so that after some time, they will be able to reintegrate into society, work at a non-panopticon like workplace, but they'll be good, dutiful workers by that point. So says Jeremy Bentham. But that is essentially the panopticon. Now, there are people who would say that Bentham's conception of the panopticon basically is what led to sort of the whole way that the contemporary social world works as a world of sort of surveillance, and that this might be especially true in more democratic places as a way to try to, modify certain behaviors without the threat of violence. Although when you think about it, there is still a threat of violence with guards up in the tower, but nevertheless, that would potentially be the suggestion. Now, I do think we can see elements of this throughout the castle. Kay is desperate to talk to Clam, the castle director, and he can't. Freda, who is at first Clam's mistress and then eventually Kay's fiance, does allow Kay to glimpse Clam through a peephole, and all he sees is just this kind of, again, this sounds like, dreamish, nightmarish kind of thing. This figure who's just sitting at a desk, not doing anything at all, with a cigar. And that's the only glimpse that Kay gets. But he does know that Clam is there, and he does know that Clam can see him, because there's one point where he sees that Clam is about to leave the inn. And so he waits outside for him by his carriage, and he waits and he waits and he waits, and Clam never comes out until eventually Kay is informed that Clam is not going to come out while Kay is there. So you might as well just go in, because as long as you're standing there, Clam is not coming out. So they know what Kay is doing, right? Kay is watching him. Kay does exist. And Kay just in some ways has to assume that he's always being monitored, I think. And in fact, at one point, there's even a hint that Clam is using Kay's assistants to do surveillance on Kay. At one point, Freda says of the assistants, she says, their eyes, those naive but sparkling eyes, somewhat remind me of Clam's eyes. Yes, that's it. I'm doing Freda now. That's it. Clam's glance sometimes leaps from their eyes and goes straight through me. So these, again, she says they have Clam's eyes, and who's been with Kay almost the entire time following him around, but these assistants with Clam's eyes. And yes, it is weird having to say Clam this much in a discussion. So we can see then how the village has in some ways probably always worked this way. You know that they know what you're up to, and you have to in some ways behave as if they can always see you, but you can never really know what they are up to. And so this means that you will inevitably act in line, do the thing that they want you to do, or that you think that they want you to do. And this is what partly makes the castle interesting when paired up with the trial, because in the trial, it really seems like it's only a small percentage of people who are ensnared by this totally incomprehensible and inaccessible system of law. But in the castle, Kafka casts this wider net where everybody is ensnared by this totally incomprehensible and inaccessible system. And most people have accepted it and internalized it. And they do know that it exists. Whereas in the trial, it seems that only the people who have been charged by this system of law or work within the system really know about it. Yes, it's true as the book goes on, Kay does. In the trial, Joseph Kay finds out that more and more people know about this than he would have believed before, but it's not everybody who knows about it. Well, in the castle, everybody that's in the book does know about it. They know about the castle, and they are acting accordingly. Now, Kay is an interesting figure in this respect because he's actually the one person who doesn't know about the way the system works at the beginning of the book. He comes into this unknown village as a stranger, and this affects the way that he is treated. On the one hand, then the villagers look on him very much as a figure of suspicion. And you can see why. If everyone is essentially following the same norms, an outsider can be risky because they might not follow the same norms as everybody else. They could muck up the system in some way. And so, yeah, you do want to look at them kind of closely. Are they going to be one of us? One of us, one of us. Or, reference to Freaks, check it out. Or is this going to be something that throws everything off? And K does kind of throw things off. He does make waves. He's constantly making waves, trying to figure out what's going on, right? And this alone makes him stand out. He could have probably saved himself a lot of trouble just by kind of accepting everything at first, right? And again, sort of think about how this sort of relates in our real life to the way that so many people engage with the political world. You know, they say, yeah, I know there's something going on. And I know some tangential things about it. You know, I've heard the word recession. I know there's recession. You know, I get it. I know some key names. You know, I know Trudeau. You know, I know Doug Ford. I know who I like. I know who I don't like. But essentially, I know I don't like. I know I don't like this recession. I can't define it for you. And if you really ask me to explain it, I would not get very far. But I do know one thing: I don't like it. So basically, I'm just going to stay out of it. You know, let them do their work. You know, every couple of years, I'll put my X beside the names that I like, and then they'll go back to their job. I'll go back to doing what I have to do. K, though, that's like most people, I think. But K is, in some sense, one of those pesky figures who's constantly trying to make people in power justify themselves, to explain themselves. And he's disrupting everything. As these two scholars, Lee and Ross, point out, there is this strain in Kafka's literature where it seems to revere, at the very least, the act of trying to get clarity from the lack of clarity. For example, they say that in the castle, that Kay gets upset with Barnabas for not trying hard enough to actually find out what goes inside the castle. You know, you're in there every day. What do you mean you don't know what's going on? You're right there. If I was there, I'd be trying so hard to figure out. You're in there all the time and you're doing nothing. Anyway, those writers, they say that Kay's disapproval stems from Barnabas's inaction. In another Kafka novel, one that I haven't read, America, I've read the first chapter of it. But in that novel, they say, Carl is the only prospective employee of the Oklahoma Theater willing to go deep into the racetrack in search of the management. But Barnabas, like the dawdling bystanders, allows doubt to stop him, something that Kafka deems negligence of duty. Kafka's stance, they say, this is their point of view, was that one must fight to get to the top. One must take advantage of everything that offers any hope. However, if that is his message, then his other message in his books seems to be that, sure, one must take advantage of everything that offers any hope, but it's probably not going to work out for you, right? There is hope, but not for us. So I guess in some way, life is about making the effort, despite it getting you about as far as the person who makes no effort at all. Now, okay, so I'm making a big claim there to some degree that putting in this effort isn't going to work out for you. So where do we see that in the book? Well, I'll explain again. Just give me a second. Well, again, as the books go on, Kay becomes increasingly more and more like the villagers. He becomes exhausted from never being able to get a good night's sleep. But also seemingly exhausted from just being beaten by the system. As one scholar puts it, Kay progresses from a subversive position of autonomy and defiance to one of growing subjection to and compliance with the rules. His internal change is mediated by the humbling treatment he suffers at the hands of the authorities and by his increasing awareness of the futility of all his efforts to reach the castle. And I think that you could probably say that one of the reasons why Kay wants to marry Freda in the first place, and again, all of this happens very abruptly, right? He meets Kay, they have an intimate night in the bar, and then he wants to marry her. Why does he do this? Well, it's probably because she has some connection to the castle, right? Through being Clam's mistress. And again, at one point, he even says, it was the nearness of Clam that made her so irrationally seductive, right? That can, again, mean a couple things. One, just the fact that she is, in some sense has a relation with Clam that, yes, that makes her enticing to him because Clam is a conduit to the castle, or is even an answer, right? So in that sense, Freda is enticing, but also potentially it's the enticement of power, that he gets to be sort of just even not get an answer, but gets to be near power to some degree. It could be that too. But significantly, he takes her away from Clam and the bar from where they met. And in some respects, this would maybe be a big power play for Kay, a big move, right? He seems to be challenging them to some degree, but this is only very temporary. In the end, Freda ends up leaving Kay for Jeremiah, one of the oafish assistants, whom she had previously linked with Clam, right? She sees in his eyes Clam. And then Kay is essentially told by Clam's assistant that she has to go back to work at the bar. So really, everything goes back to the way it was for the most part. He accomplishes nothing, right? However, I don't think that the book is simply demonstrating that the way, or demonstrating the way we internalize power, and that any attempts to resist it will be effective. I do want to suggest something a little bit different beyond just this Panopticon reading. And to do so, I want to focus in for a few minutes on the story that Olga tells Kay about their families, about her family's downfall. This is, I think, an important story to look at when thinking about the castle, because it takes up a lot of space in the book. And it's really kind of a very interesting section of the book. So I think it's well worth spending some time talking about. Again, just to repeat, the story is that you have this one family in town who was once quite prosperous, but then they have this dramatic fall when one of the daughters, Amalia, refuses to visit this representative of the castle, Sortini, a castle official, when he propositions her in apparently this really awful way. And when she slaps the messenger who sends her the message from Sortini and ends up ripping up Sortini's note, Amalia sets in process this chain of events that will lead to the downfall of her family. It leads to her father being fired from his job with the fire company. It leads to the family being shunned and plunged into poverty. Now, on the one hand, I think you can say, yes, this is like the Panopticon, because at no point does the law actually entangle itself in Amalia's family. Sortini doesn't do anything. He doesn't say, you will now be shunned, you will go to jail, you will be punished. He doesn't do any of that. Their downfall is specifically the result of the villagers having internalized the norms of the town so thoroughly, which includes strict obedience to those in power, so that anybody who deviates from those norms is going to be publicly shunned. And yet, at the same time, the Panopticon theory really hinges on this notion that power is the thing that really does nothing, right? It just has to exist, like the structure in the middle of the room, in order for people to obey. But in this case, even though it is the case that Sortini doesn't say, you will now be punished, or any of that, he's not that. He is a powerful figure who acts. He acts as if anyone in the village will simply bend to his command. He sends the letter, expecting that merely a letter that says all sorts of terrible things, right? Just on the basis of his power and authority alone, that Amalia will come running to him, right? That's different from the kind of thing that we're seeing with the Panopticon, where power is in the shadows, right? Where it's covered up. That is a very explicit and overt act. And there are other instances in the book where the more powerful pull their weight, where they act to make sure that things happen, right? When Clam's secretary does tell Kay, yeah, Freda is going to return to the bar and you're going to make sure that that happens, right? That is, again, power acting in this very overt and explicit way. So in this world, what we really see are panopticon-like conditions where people are sort of conditioned to internalize the norms of their society, which includes being obedient to those in power. But Kafka doesn't write powerful people in this book strictly as people watching the powerless from a distance and making sure that they follow the rules. Instead, he writes them as people who are capable of doing these really awful things and who will step in and act when one of the powerless people steps out of line and no one else in the village is effective at stopping them. See, Sortini didn't have to come in because the village was effective enough at shunning them. But if they hadn't done that, would Sortini have been simply just comfortable sitting back and doing nothing? I think we're seeing enough evidence in the text, like when Clam's secretary says, okay, enough's enough, she's coming back, that things would have been different if the villagers ended up doing nothing. So again, to some degree, I think what we're seeing an even more nuanced version in the castle than what we see when people tend to talk about the Panopticon. And consequently, in this book, I think we do get a pretty good vision of a sort of modern society that purports to be democratic, but so often isn't. Yes, people have the basic freedom to do whatever it is they want, but because that's a terrifying prospect to those who hold power, it's necessary to, in the word, and of course he has to come up in every podcast, so here it is again, take your drink for those of you who are watching at home, playing the home game. In the words of Noam Chomsky, it is necessary to manufacture the consent of people who are living in a democracy. Because if you don't do that, they'll lose control, the kind of control that you want them to have. So Chomsky is saying manufacture consent in reference to the role that the media plays in convincing the public to accept the point of view of the rulers. But there's various institutions in our lives that attempt to clamp down on people who don't behave the way that they say that the way that you're supposed to behave. Right? Chomsky also talks about the education system and how it, quote, I'm quoting Chomsky here, selects for obedience, meaning that starting from kindergarten up, you slowly start to learn that the way that you really succeed is by following the rules. There's some wiggle room. You can get away with being a bit of a class clown and making some remarks and doing some silly things. But essentially, you have to fall into line. I remember when I was in grade 5, for example, I had a teacher who was arguing with me because I suggested that Mexico was not a state. So I'm just going to let that sit there for a second. And by the way, this is not a circumstance where I'm trying to pat myself on the back, where I'm going to suggest that I'm morally and intellectually superior because I knew that Mexico was its own country. I think that's pretty minor, rudimentary knowledge. And it's knowledge that I had in grade 5, which I think, again, a lot of people do, except for my grade 5 teacher, who, to her credit, was not in grade 5 at the time. But we went back and forth on it. And I do eventually remember simply just saying, oh, it's okay. Mexico's not a state. And yeah, that's essentially what you have to do. But I mean, to some degree, just to use a little bit of that Jeremy Bentham in here, it can become a little bit like muscle memory, right? Where first you kind of learn, okay, I got to say this in order to get by. I got to do this in order to get by. But eventually, it's just potentially for a lot of people training. And those who never learn it get weeded out, right? Those who can't. And there's always a few that kind of squeak through the system. But for the most part, those who really succeed and get through are the ones that learned at some point that, yeah, you play by the book, you follow the rules, you succeed. And well, that's a way that consent gets manufactured, because by the time you end up leaving high school, for the most part, you've accepted that if someone is more powerful than you, then their problem, so that by the time you even get to the point where you're making kind of big decisions, you've already kind of accepted that. Again, I'm speaking very generally here. There are certainly exceptions to this, but for the most part, I do think that what Chomsky says has some legitimacy there. So yeah, let me just kind of get my bearings here. So and again, this is in many ways what gets called a democracy in our times, but it is really just a dysfunctional distortion of democracy. Now, many people read Kafka and they see in him an anticipation of fascism in the 20th century. Remember, Kafka's writing, for the most part, in the 19 teens and the 1920s. And so I think a lot of people see in him, yeah, he's basically anticipating fascism that emerges in the 1930s and then blows up in a spectacularly horrific way in the 1940s up until 1945. But I think that what we see, in fact, is a sort of dreamlike version of the world we live in now. It's kind of like the underlining subconscious of our own current society, and maybe the society that Kafka lived in as well. And the fact that so many people see it as being like fascism is maybe revealing something about our own society and whether it is as free and democratic as we like to think it is. So those are the thoughts that I had about the castle. If Ryan is still around, or if anybody in the audience wants to comment on this, as I say, Ryan, if you do want to hop on the stream, please feel free to let me know, and I can send you the link. But if you don't want to do that, if you have any questions about what I've talked about, Ryan is here. There he is. So I don't know if you mean that you are here still in the room, or if you're behind me somewhere. But as I say, Ryan, if you do want to hop on, I can give you. Actually, I'll send you the link right now. So have a look on Facebook. But does not mean you have to come on. But I am going to send it to you. Just give me 1 second here. I've done it. So it's there in case you do want to come on. But yeah, otherwise, again, I will talk a little bit, I think, about what is coming up over the next little while, or a couple things that I want to do. As I say, just to repeat the point that I was making before, I do want to focus in on another writer for potentially a couple of months. As I say, Edgar Allan Poe right now is the leading contender. There's so many authors that I want to do at some point, like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Dickens, Faulkner, J.D. Salinger, Virginia Woolf, people like that. But again, if anybody has any suggestions about that, I also want to focus in on a filmmaker. So I've been doing a lot of random films, ones that kind of catch my attention, and I've had some great conversations about them. However, I would also like to spend some time, just like I've been doing with Kafka, looking at a particular filmmaker. And I really want to be concentrating for at least a while, and bear with me, I want to be concentrating on foreign language filmmakers. So I'm thinking here about Ingmar Bergman, or Federico Fellini, or Antonioni, or Francois Truffaut, or Jean-Luc Godard, or Akira Kurosawa, or Ozu. Who else? Who did the Apu trilogy? I can't remember his name right now. Just a sec. Should know this, but in the moment, I can never remember. Oh, Ray. Yeah. So any of those sort of filmmakers, I would love to talk about at some point. I am also thinking about talking next week a little bit about another conversation about Canada's role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So that's right now where I'm thinking about going with it. So, but we will see what is coming up. So yes, those are the plans. But if anybody again has any, if Ryan has any questions, because I know that you're here, if you have any questions or thoughts about the castle, please feel free to ask or to make the comment. Otherwise, I might just indeed wrap up. Or I could wrap up potentially with a couple of. Oh, Ryan says, give me a few minutes. Okay, well, I could do that. I can vamp for a little bit. Or what I might do, in fact, is take a quick break by putting up in a minute. I will put up the I'll put up the theme again, and then maybe when we come back, Ryan will be here. But in the meantime, I will just sort of give my general thoughts about Kafka. After this discussion, I will say that Kafka continues to be one of my favorite authors. I don't think I would put him up there with my all-time favorite authors. Like what I mean by that is he's not in the top three, but certainly I could see him being in the top 10. And as I say, I do think that Kafka has this knack of tapping into the kind of subconscious in a way that I'm unfamiliar with other authors doing. I do see it sometimes in film. I think that a movie like Mulholland Drive, for example, which is telling a very different sort of story than the kind of stories that Kafka tells, but I do think that also the Twin Peaks movie probably articulates that sort of dreamlike space a little bit as well. And again, I think that that's a major contribution of Kafka. The other major contribution, of course, is the way that he engages with the way that power operates. I think he does it in a way that's not only very accurate, but also extraordinarily relevant to the way we think about power in our own time. And I think that that's done very effectively in all of his stories, but I especially think that it's effectively done in The Judgment. And it is effectively done in the trial as well. But one thing that I will say as well, and Ryan and I, in fact, were talking about this the other night and may talk about again in just a couple of minutes. But one of the things that we did mention is that Kafka probably does work better on a smaller scale. One of the things that I think is worth mentioning about Kafka, if I haven't mentioned it already, and maybe I have, but Kafka had all sorts of things going on while being a writer. Being a writer was not his full-time job. He wrote in his off hours, and he was not a famous writer, so it's not like people were anticipating his next book or his next story. There was nobody really giving him a lot of time or money or even encouragement to continue to write. So, he had all sorts of things going on. Plus, he was just so incredibly anxious about so many things. And that sort of anxiety, I think, also held him up. And he's constantly talking in his diaries, apparently, which I've never read in full, but I've certainly read a lot of quotes from since starting on this project in January. He's talking a lot about how he has this great idea, and then within a few days he thinks it's a terrible idea and he can't bring himself to write anything more about it, and so on and so forth. all of those things sort of combined to me to make sense that I just don't think Kafka had the ability to give a novel the kind of attention that it would have deserved. And I'm even talking about by his own standards. I certainly think he's such a great writer that he was quite capable of writing a great novel. I just don't know if he had maybe the psychological capacity or just the material time in order to actually write one to his satisfaction. And so we are left with 3 novels that he started and never finished. Well, I can't speak for America, but I can speak for The Trial and I can speak for The Castle and say that they're both extraordinarily compelling books. But even then, I would say that I would put The Judgment and Metamorphosis and especially in the Penal Colony ahead of The Trial and The Castle. So I think just based on what I have read over the last couple of months, and this is just my own opinion, that his masterwork is in the Penal Colony. But Metamorphosis is also, in my opinion, one of the greatest pieces of writing as well. And The Judgment, which is a smaller piece, is also an excellent bit of writing. And The Trial and The Castle are great too. But again, I think that for all the reasons that I mentioned, that I think that he worked best with a smaller canvas than with a larger one. So I think what I'm going to do is, for a moment, I will go to our theme song. Maybe I'll play it a few times, I'm not sure. But I'll go to our theme song and I will see, you will see, if Ryan is here when we get back. So forgive me for a little bit of this improvisational way of handling this episode, but I do think it might be worth our while just having a little chat afterwards to see what Ryan thinks about it. So I'm going to just go off here for a second. I'm going to get up our song, and then I'll be back in a couple of minutes. So hold on to your hats, folks. Up yours, woke moralists. Look who's here.
Hey.
Well, I'm sorry for giving you no warning about
That's okay. I don't have a lot to say, but I had a couple of questions.
Yeah. Let's first of all, thank you so much for coming on. Like I said earlier in the day, I thought, I wonder if Ryan would want to come on at some point during this discussion.
Yeah.
And then I thought, maybe he's busy tonight, but you're here.
Yeah.
So I thought
I wouldn't have come on if you just straight up invited me, because I would have had to have reread the book, and
yes.
and I would have liked to have done that, but I wouldn't have been able to fit it in. But I was thinking from when you were talking.
Oh, so this is an excellent plan. This is an excellent plan to do it.
This is a great plan.
Yeah.
So the question I have, first of all, it's a question about, have you read Another Thing? But have you read The Refusal, the Kafka story, The Refusal?
I don't know if I have. Hold on, let me just. I'm gonna grab my the short story one that I have, the collection. It might be in here, in which case I would have read it, I think, at one point, but it may have been. There's one called The Rejection, so that's probably
Well,
the
that's
same.
got to be it. That's got to be
Yeah.
it.
But I most likely read it, but I don't remember it.
Because it seemed relevant, sort of. So it seemed relevant to the two interpretations that you were discussing.
Right.
Because I mean, I don't know about these interpretations except insofar as you've described them.
Yeah.
But I wasn't thinking that they were necessarily opposed. And I was thinking that this story, The Refusal, which I just happened to have read because I was tutoring kids on the internet, and it was like the California curriculum, like it's part of the high school curriculum.
Oh, really?
But
it's very short,
anyway,
by the way. It's just one page for those of you.
Oh, that's not it then.
Oh, it's not?
That's not it. Yeah, that wouldn't be it. This one's longer. This one's like, I looked it up. It's from 1920. I was looking for a text of it. So yeah, you mentioned these two interpretations, right? One of which is that these people in the castle are divine figures. Mm-hmm. And the other of which seemed to be the novel's a criticism of a kind of conformity. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the thing about this refusal story is like, it's an interpretation, but I feel strongly about it. If I had the text, I would feel even more strongly, or I'd confirm or deny it. But I remember getting the sense when reading it that like he seemed to really believe that people want authority. Like the weird idea in the story. So what happens in the story is that it describes this, yearly meeting or quasi-regular meeting that happens between the townspeople and these authorities. And the authorities are very ordinary looking. There are some weirdnesses about them. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, they don't seem to be too distant, but the people nevertheless engage in this great amount of ritual and anticipation for the meeting with this, civic administrator. And even he's not, in a typical Kafka style, he's not one of the big ones. If anything, he's like 30th on the list and such and such. But, he constantly refuses their petitions. And in the last paragraph, it describes that the people are actually really satisfied that he refuses their petitions. It says, except for a few young men between the ages of 17 and 20 or something, who it says something like who have too many revolutionary ideas because they don't understand life. Like it says something like this. Like this is a paraphrase.
Wow.
But Kafka's, and it's not clear that the narrator is Kafka.
Sure.
But it seems to me like it's not like, I don't think that he's being an authoritarian there. I think he's more trying to adopt the perspective of like the ordinary person, which in his mind, at least in this story, seems to be someone who actually would prefer to have a rigid hierarchy, even if it constantly lets them down. Because the weird thing about the story is like, what on earth are they happy about? Like they're deeply relaxed, a great feeling of relaxation. It's not really joy. I wish I had the text, but it's more something like relaxation and sort of like satisfaction. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so what I was thinking about those two interpretations is I imagine that you could probably put them together, right? Because if you're Kafka and you're probably an atheist, you're going to think that our projection of the divine is going to be just that. And, So I guess I kind of agree with both interpretations, with less criticism in the second. Like it's, but I don't know. This is just based on one story.
Yes.
But, the idea being something like people want the people in the castle to know, what's what, and they want them to be able to provide salvation. But in fact, the evidence presented by the representatives is nothing but silly. Like they're not terribly respectable.
Yeah.
And yet people crave this. I don't know. So there's both a divine element, and maybe Kafka believes this is real, or maybe not. But you could tilt from one to the other. That was my thought. It seemed more reasonable to come on here than to type it out in the comments.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm really want to read this other story, and I don't know why it's not in this book, which is weird.
Yeah, I had a hard time finding it when I was looking right now. I looked through a collected story that I had.
Yeah,
it's from 1920.
Yeah, because he wrote a book called A Country Doctor: Short Prose for My Father in 1920, or there was a collection.
I think it's from that. I think that's
really?
From that.
Okay.
Maybe not. Maybe A Country Doctor is only like 4 stories. Is that the one with like
No, it's got probably
the
about 12.
hunger artist and stuff in it?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and
Uh,
Josephine.
no. Hunger Artist is
Oh,
no. That's a Hunger Artist, which came
oh
out
okay.
in 1924, and that does have 4 in it, and that has a Hunger
Oh,
Artist and Josephine the singer.
oh, okay.
But yeah, it's funny. So I wonder if, because this is all stuff that was this is the entirety of his published material in his lifetime.
Oh, yeah. This story wasn't published.
Okay, so that's why it didn't end up in this
Yeah,
book.
yeah.
But yeah, so no, yeah, that could very well be true, and I think that there is something to that, because once again, if you think about our just a lot of people in our day-to-day life, you hear nothing but people complaining about the system,
Right.
quite rightly. I think that
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah,
But when you suggest, well, what would you think about dismantling that system? They would say,
yeah,
well, you're crazy. It's a
yeah. Well,
terrible idea.
I guess it's hard to say, but Kafka doesn't strike me as like a revolutionary. He strikes me as too pessimistic for that. But maybe that's just me. And
Well, I think to be revolutionary, you need to have a bit more of a political bent to you than I
yeah,
think
yeah.
Kafka does.
Whereas
Which
Kafka doesn't.
I mean, Kafka is, well, he is. I know that he apparently in his writings he does show a lot of interest in anarchism.
Uh-huh.
And I think Kropotkin is the anarchist that Kafka connects
No.
with. So I guess he does actually have some political perspectives, but he's not so political that his writing is explicitly political. You know what I mean? Like, it's
Yeah.
dealing with much more abstract things. I think the fact that he has these political leanings in his life suggests that you can do a political reading of these texts,
Right.
but they're not overtly or explicitly political in the way that a Charles Dickens book is political,
Yeah.
or Victor Hugo or something like that.
Well, if they are political, they're not like practically political. Like,
Yeah.
there's no concrete plan for action that comes from somebody who's so pessimistic.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think, yeah, so he's pessimistic to the point where I do think that he believes that, yeah, I think that, anarchist principles are ideal, but I don't think that there's anything I can do to change what's happening, and I can't see that change happening within my lifetime and all that kind of stuff, which he would have been right about.
Yeah.
So there is that, and so yeah, I think that he's much more, while he might have those political beliefs, that he becomes more committed to issues of the mind and things that people are kind of going through in their sort of day-to-day lives.
Right.
So yeah, so I don't know what kind of led me down on that tangent, but
Anyway, yeah, well, yeah, no, I think that there's some things that support both of the readings that you like in the novel, just based on your synopsis, which was really helpful.
Yeah, okay.
I remembered a lot of things, like the fact that he has sex with someone that he's not really supposed to have sex with, and that this leads through some weird turn of events that could not have been foreseen to his being excluded from the castle, seems to support a sort of like salvation reading. Like, it's like he's done some morally transgressive thing. And the weird thing is, like, the explanation of why he gets banned is all kind of like, it's not something you'd naturally expect. It's like you do one thing and you're not supposed to do it, but then you do it and all this other stuff happens. And then somewhere down the line, like, you're excluded from
Yeah. Well, I do
Yeah.
think there is this kind of weird thing in Kafka, and it's not that weird, I suppose, when you think about it. I was just reading a book the other day, in fact, that talks about how this tends to be a preoccupation of lots of writers from that time who are kind of, either just immediately before Freud or immediately after Freud, who, like Dostoevsky does this a lot, where you have a person who, in some ways, acts out against something almost because they know that it's wrong.
Yeah.
There is this kind of desire not to do a bad thing, but it's because, like, it's because, you know, you think I'm going to do something bad and I resent you for that, and my way of acting out is to actually do the bad thing in some way.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of an odd sort of psychological reason why one can go about doing that. And I think that there's an element of that in a lot of Kafka's works, where people do the thing that they really know deep down they should not be doing, and is actually not going to help them in the long run. That they just end up saying the wrong thing, having an outburst at the wrong time. You've got this guy that you want to ingratiate yourself to, Clam. And now I'm going to be very obstinate for the rest of the book about I'm marrying his mistress, and I don't care what he has to say. But by the way, I really want to meet you, and all this kind of stuff. So there is this kind of like this pull of Kafka's characters towards them doing the thing that they know that they don't want to do, and they know is going to hurt them in the long run.
So is this the last Kafka episode? This is it, right?
Well, I think that someday I might look at the America book, but I'm going to move on from Kafka for a while.
Because I wanted to ask you a question.
Yeah.
So you had read the Trial and the Judgment before, right?
Yes.
And this was your first time reading The Castle.
Yeah.
What was, I mean, did anything surprise you from reading Kafka again for this? Like, is there something that you didn't think of Kafka as doing before that you learned through doing this?
I mean, a lot of things surprised me, because when I had read a lot of these stories, I read In the Penal Colony in high school. I had read The Trial in undergrad, and Metamorphosis in undergrad, and The Judgment. I can't remember when I read that for the first time, probably a little bit later. And I don't know about you, but certainly in my early reading days, I wasn't knowledgeable enough to really make sense of the stories on their own terms. I kind of had a preconception in my uneducated mind about what it was these books were going to do before I read them. And they kind of confirmed that suspicion for me as I was reading them. But I was so often misreading them because of those things. And it takes a while. It took a while for me, at least, to read the stories on their own terms. Right. So I think that the thing about Kafka that really surprised me was, and I've mentioned this, I think, in a couple of the podcasts, was in fact how normal everything is sort of written.
I see.
And because you come away from these books thinking they're surreal, they are, like, they're experimental in some ways, and in fact they're not. In fact, they're written pretty plainly, and in a way that's quite straightforward. And I lent out some of the books to a friend of mine, and he struggled a little bit because Kafka writes these extremely long paragraphs. And so, he kind of takes you and he holds on to you, and he really sort of, in some ways, demands your attention, because he's not writing in a way that's particularly poetic, which you would expect in a story about a guy who turns into a cockroach, or you would expect in a story about a guy who's put on trial for a reason he doesn't know. They're written as if it's normal. But to me, that's in some ways what the strength of Kafka is, because it's disarming and it's disorienting in the way that he does it, in the fact that he presents these worlds as being so bizarre, but writing about them in a way that's so normal.
I like that description. I think that's really accurate. Like, because neither the characters nor the narrator, they seldom react in ways that suggest that they're surprised or shocked. Like, you mentioned the description of the insect. Like, it's not given this really surreal description with all of these, like, you could have imagine a really, like, Poe, if you're going to do Poe, like Poe would give a description of this thing that like a scarab beetle that would be really I don't know,
Yeah. Well,
moving and surreal and uncanny, and make you feel like through the description that this is really weird, like, you know, like someone like David Lynch, like, who really leans into the strangeness, whereas Kafka's just kind of like, oh yeah, this guy woke up, he was a bug, he wasn't all that shocked about it, like he tried to go about his day, his family was mostly pissed off at him more than anything else.
Yeah.
Rather than questioning like how this is possible, they're just angry.
Yeah.
There's like a very interesting juxtaposition between the way that it's presented, the tone, and the actual content, because the tone always seems to be very matter of fact.
There's that Norm Macdonald joke where he says that when he realized that hypnotists were frauds, where he saw a guy hypnotizing a guy to turn into a chicken, and then he saw the guy later in the parking lot. And he's like, "What was that like being a chicken?" And the guy was like, "Oh, it was cool."
Yeah.
Like, there's no way that was real, because if you had actually for 5 minutes of your life thought you were a chicken, there is no way that you'd ever actually be able to get back to behaving like a normal human being.
Yeah, you'd quit your job. I mean, you'd probably quit your job and join a cult of some kind. Like, if this is possible.
Yeah, it would be a life-changing, mind-altering event.
Right.
And that's what you think too about Samsa being turned into a cockroach. But yeah, I mean, he's not happy about it. But he's not like, every day I'd be like, oh my God, what is happening here? This is crazy. But
they're he's so stoic about it too. Like, he doesn't go to his family like, look what happened to me. Can you believe what the heck? Like, he doesn't even so much as say what the heck. He's just like, no. Or express any kind of exasperation. It's more just like, oh, this is unfortunate.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the same thing with Joseph K. in the trial. I mean, Joseph K. is about annoyed at what's happening. He is annoyed, but he's annoyed in like people get annoyed when they're stuck in traffic.
Yeah. He's annoyed, but he's not. His mind isn't blown. Like, he's still within the framework. And when he criticizes the institutions, it's more from like sort of superficial dysfunctionality. It's like, I can't believe that they run this show out of this building. Like, it's not so much like, and you know, he just kind of thinks, well, they must have some, but there's a real attempt at rationalizing maybe.
And that's why, again, I keep coming back to this idea of it being like a dream, because like, it's hardly ever, at least in my dreams, I'm never like, wait a minute, we're in 1992.
Yeah,
like that's not possible. How did we get to 1992?
Yeah, exactly. It is. That's right, because you don't. It's the abnormal presented as just like perfectly normal, like in a dream, and you don't know.
Yeah. So that I don't think I quite grasped with Kafka the first time. I think I was expecting it to be just like wall to wall, bizarre and surreal, and I think I saw it that way incorrectly.
Yeah.
In seeing it that way, I missed what was actually there, and what's actually there is much more interesting, I think.
I think that's because I wanted to ask you that, just in case there's people that haven't read Kafka, because there's such a strong idea of what Kafka is like, right? And so people might think he's one of the authors that I think, antecedent to reading him, you really think that you know what Kafka's about.
Yeah.
Like, there are lots of authors that are kind of like, you might have a rough idea, but I don't know. We don't have an idea of like what's Virginia Woolf like before we read Virginia Woolf. We might have like vague, but with Kafka, it's like really specific.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's got a whole term, right? Kafka-esque.
Yeah. And
then you see movies that get called Kafka-esque, and you watch them and you think, I don't know.
Yeah. Like something like David Lynch is a good comparison, because David Lynch is not Kafka-esque. Like, I think in some ways, yes, but certainly not.
Well, he does do that dream world. As I was saying before, he does do that dream world thing.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. And I guess it isn't. The characters don't usually react as though it's abnormal, but the tone is very different. Like, David Lynch seems like really aware that like this is maybe not. You're right though. There's lots of David Lynch where the abnormal is presented as like fairly routine.
Yeah, but I do think you're right. It's a different kind of dream. I think where you can compare them is the fact that they both have a way of showing a sort of a dreamlike world. But it is a different kind of dream, definitely.
And capturing the logic of a dream and the way that things happen.
Yeah. And I think too that in some of at least the Lynch work that I think that people hook into or talk about a lot, they are doing the sort of thing that I've suggested before that Kafka's not really doing, which is he's doing that kind of nightmare where you don't wake up screaming, or you don't get really upset, but
Yeah.
it's just something is so bizarre that it ends up. But in David Lynch's world, there is a lot more. Like I'm thinking of Eraserhead, where there's actual kind of horrific things that you see.
Yeah, and he also leans into that to like get your attention, whereas Kafka doesn't. Like, I guess what I was thinking is like there's a lot of times when Kafka could go into the strangeness of the whole thing, but he seldom does.
Yeah.
There's a couple of descriptions of the insect that are quite powerful, and like the noise that it makes that are kind of very uncanny, surreal, that body horror, you know, but not so much.
Yeah, and again with Metamorphosis, like it's in one of the things that's interesting about that book is that, or that story, is that it doesn't end with the death of Gregor Samsa. It goes on. And then you end up getting a fairly normal family drama story. It doesn't go on for that long. It goes on for maybe another 2 pages, but it's a fairly normal. They sit around the table, they mourn for their son, and then they go and they take a carriage ride, and the parents notice how old they're, or you know, how their young daughter is getting older. And that's, you know, that's it, which again suggests that, you know, it's more about sort of the normal thing than it is about the weird thing.
I think that's a novel that someone should attempt, right? Like the first 20 pages, there's a guy who turns into a bug and then he dies, and there's 400 other pages, and it's just like a typical like parlor room romantic drama.
Yeah.
And nobody
it could be like, it would be neat if it was like something that was somewhere within like a book like War and Peace, like
just at the beginning. It's just like, oh, there's also this bug character.
Yeah, because it is like when you read those really long novels, like I remember really hooking into like Les Miserables, and it starts off with this priest character, and you get really into this character, but you know, you end up reading it for a while. 500 pages later, he hasn't been mentioned at all. He's nowhere near the story anymore, and it's like, oh yeah, I forgot that was actually an element of the story. So it would be great if that was like something that you would see in like a Tolstoy novel, where it's like, there was this bug, but now we're at war. And
I mean,
more significant things going on.
If I were Tolstoy, I would stick a character like that like 700 pages in, just to, you know, mess with students, undergraduates who haven't read the book, and then all of a sudden they're talking about like this bug man. Think about a bug man.
And then you see everybody in the room looking around.
Like, what the heck? There's a bug man in this? When he spawns himself outside the royal palace and leaves that sludge. Character steps on
it. I wouldn't put it past him. It does seem like
you never know. He's pretty wily that way, Tolstoy.
Yeah, he is. Well, do you have any other thoughts? I really appreciate it.
I don't have any other thoughts. I wanted to ask you for some more reflection on Kafka, and I got it. So I'm happy with that.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate you coming on, especially at notice that was so short that it was mid-show. So I do appreciate that.
I was watching the episode and I thought, if I have something to say, I'll come on. And then I had something to say. So
awesome. That's great. So since you're here, do you want to do some plugs?
Well, I'm still going to be doing concerts. I'm trying to do concerts still weekly. Starting to do some shows in front of people now. So I'm concentrating more on that. But there will be a show on Friday.
On your channel?
Yeah, on my channel.
Awesome.
Port Hope, everybody.
Port Hope. Yeah. Great shows.
Get in early so that you can say that you were there at the beginning.
Absolutely. I was into Ryan before it was cool.
Yeah.
And I can say that. I can say that.
Yeah, exactly. the first 100 people will have lifelong. I will have a special place for you in Port Hope world.
That's amazing. I'm part of that. I'm part of that 100, right?
You are absolutely, Jesse.
Okay, good. That's all that matters. Well, thank you so much, Ryan.
I look forward, if you do Edgar Allan Poe, I look forward to that. I don't know Poe very well at all, so I really look forward to that.
Okay, awesome. Well, that might be the one that I do next. We will see. Do you have any other suggestions?
I have a suggestion, but it's kind of weird.
Okay, let's hear it.
And it's probably something that you haven't read.
Yeah.
But I've been reading lately. There's a bunch of writers called the French Decadent writers who come sort of between Flaubert and Proust, and they're they're not read at all. Like, if you want something that's unpopular and I think also important,
Yeah.
I mean, it's also provocative and intentionally so, but it's a really weird time period, I think, that doesn't get studied. So there's a novel called, usually translated Against Nature, French novel. The author's name Huysmans, and it's a really bizarre novel. Like, it's probably something that people haven't read. I hadn't read it until recently, but also like something that's really unique. Short too. That would be. I only thought of that because those authors were really influenced by Poe. Yeah. But yeah, I don't know. Against Nature is like this guy who doesn't like human beings anymore. They're all very misanthropic, and he decides that he's going to build this like sensorium, basically. Like, he's going to retire to. He's very wealthy. He's going to like build this perfectly stimulating house with like the best combination of smells. There's entire chapters about like colors, and you might think that that's boring, but it's fascinating. Like comparisons between. There's this part where he talks about like almost synesthesia, understanding of like liqueur and how different liqueurs have different tonalities, and he wants to build like symphony, but he has these like bottles in his with these like little spigots that he combines these liquors. It's really weird.
That's cool.
Anyway, that would be my recommendation, but I think you should do Poe first.
Okay, well, I will. I just opened up that book on my Wikipedia.
Yeah, so check it out. That guy's very interesting author. He's very, very dark, but not in a way that would, I think, alienate your viewers.
Okay, awesome. Well, I appreciate that. And my viewers, I will say, are pretty dark.
A lot of them are.
They have seen it all. So
yeah, I know. They've been around the block.
So yeah, so I appreciate that. I will definitely look into it. Thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. Anytime.
All right. Well, we will see you. We will see you on here again, and I will remove you here. Right. So I appreciate you coming on. And my final thing that I will say, because I want to end in total Kafka fashion, so I just want to say